All right, gang. So tonight we are going to talk for a few minutes about the Russian Revolution and specifically as it relates to World War One. Now, the Russian Revolution, if you know anything about history, before this results in the arrival of the first communist country in the world. And so let's spend some time talking about why that occurs and what happens with that and how that fits with World War One. So first of all, when going back to the Russian Revolution, we really have to think about Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. If you think back to those two autocratic rulers, those two monarchs, you'll remember that they began to divide the nobility away from the people. Catherine the Great wanted the people to nobility to speak French. Peter the Great made them change the way they dressed, and so both of those people really made the nobility different from the average everyday people. And what that does is that creates a rift or a divide. Okay. And so it separates the nobility more than just financially, but their culture from the average people. And that really begins to upset people. So time wears on. And this is like 150, 200 years in the past before the Russian Revolution in 1917, but it lays the seeds a long time. So fast forward several years, and in 1905, there's an attempted revolution, okay? And so let's talk about the attempted revolution. First of all, it came right after the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. The Tsar said, you know what, we're going to fight these Japanese. The Japanese said, you know what, we're going to fight these Russians because we want some land on the Asian continent, and we want some land outside of Japan. It was part of their whole expansion and imperialistic era. And Japan just demolished them. Okay, so people back in Moscow, way back in Moscow, were really unhappy about this. And so they fought it, or I'm sorry, not Moscow, in St. Petersburg. And so there was an attempted revolution. And what happened is that we see that Russian government reforms itself. What they do is they create for the first time a parliament, the Duma, in Russia, giving the people a say for the first time in government. But the issue is, it didn't go far enough, and so people were still really unhappy with the war. Now, so move on a couple of years. So people are really unhappy with the war effort in World War I, okay? And what happens is this. Nicholas II is Tsar, and you see his family there. If you've ever seen the Disney movie Anastasia or heard the story of Anastasia and Rasputin, well, that's the story of this family. And so what happens is, the Tsar himself, Tsar Nicholas II, Tsar just means emperor or Caesar in Russian, is the leader of the army. And initially, everybody's all prideful. Yeah, we're going to beat them. Yeah, we're going to do really well. And that doesn't work out so well. And Russia, more than anybody else, if you'll think back to the video that you watched last night, Russia suffered more casualties than anyone. And Russia took the brunt of it. There were too many deaths in the war, and there were too many poor living conditions. People were suffering. And so what happened is the government was overthrown. Okay, and the first Russian Revolution took place in March of 1917, or kind of second Russian Revolution. And what that did was that created a democratic government, a parliamentary democracy. The head of this parliamentary democracy was a guy named Alexander Kerensky, Kerenski. And Kerensky was the head of this government. But there was an issue. People didn't think that this new government went far enough. And some of those people were in what was known the Petrograd Soviet. Now, things can get kind of confusing here. The names for the cities kind of change a little bit. So St. Petersburg, the old Soviet capital or Russian capital, is Petrograd. Okay, it's just Petrograd. So a Soviet is basically the city council of St. Petersburg, and the Petrograd Soviet is just the city council, okay? Petrograd is St. Petersburg. So here's what happens. There are two groups in this, and they are essentially running the city. At the time of the initial revolution in March of 1917, there were groups of communists or socialists, as they were known as then. There were groups of communists that had kind of taken control in a lot of cities in Russia. And the Petrograd Soviet, was the strongest. But there were two groups within the Petrograd Soviet. One was known as the Bolsheviks, and they were just socialists. They were communists following Karl Marx's lead, who said that government should control land, labor, or land and capital, and use it to benefit the working class, okay? And then there were a group called the Bolsheviks. The word Bolshevik means majority, okay? And these Bolsheviks were united against the Mensheviks and were united against the Kerensky government for lots of reasons. Okay, and they claim to be the majority. Now, they're all socialists, but the Bolsheviks wanted to do something really revolutionary. They wanted to completely overthrow the current government, and they wanted to establish a true communistic government. And so what happened was, with this conflict coming out, the Bolsheviks won. Okay, now, there are lots of reasons why the Bolsheviks won. Okay, among them was that they snuck back into the country their leader, a guy named Vladimir Lenin, rather. Vladimir Lenin was snuck back into the country. He was kicked out in 1905, and Vladimir Lenin is the leader of the Bolsheviks, and he says, let's overthrow this government. So he comes back into the country. The Germans actually sneak him in because he had this slogan. Lenin's slogan was peace, land, and bread. I'll bring peace to the country, no more war. I'll give land to everybody and redistribute it equally, and everybody will have food. Well, that was in direct response to the fact that under the Tsar and under the provisional government that Kerensky led, there was no peace. They were still at war. There was no land. People still had gross inequality, and there was no bread. Nobody ate. The people were starving, so the Russians were fed up with it. Okay, and that created a perfect situation for him to lead his communist revolution. And in October of 1917, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin took over. Okay, the Bolsheviks revolted and Lenin became the head of government. So now we have the world's first communist country begins to take place. Okay, and almost immediately Lenin gets out of the war. Okay, almost immediately. He comes to power in October or November on our calendar. And almost immediately, as soon as he has power, Lenin gets out of the war with Germany. He signs the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March of 1918. Now, here's what's important about that Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They give away basically all of Western Russia. The communist said, I don't care about fighting the war. We don't need to keep land. World War I is an imperialistic land meant to oppress people and take advantage of the working class anyway. So we're here to protect their rights, and I don't care about the land, so give it away. And so Germany's happy with that because now they can focus their attention on the Western front, on Russia, or on France and Britain and the Americans that are finally starting to landfall and have been there since summer of 1917. Okay, well, so they signed that. They ended the war because too many had died. They saw problems with capitalists. Like I said, there was an imperialistic war they didn't want, and they wanted to focus on establishing communism in Russia. So what happens next is a civil war. Within Russia, Lenin knows, hey, I have to squash everybody that supports the Tsar. I've got to squash everybody that supports this old provisional government, and we have to go full bore into a full communist country. And so what results is a civil war, and it's the two sides are the red side and the white side. Okay, it's the easiest way to think about it. The Red Army are the communists, the Bolsheviks. They're known as Bolsheviks, and communists is what they start to call themselves. And the White Army was essentially everybody else. The White Army was people who supported the monarchy. There were people who supported the old provisional government, and they fought together. And eventually the Red won. But it took a long time. And eventually, in 1922, the USSR, or Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, was established. So what this means is that Russia is now a giant powerhouse communist country. They have a lot of land. They have a vast supply of resources. And now Russia is now the USSR, and they have to organize themselves and rapidly industrialize because they're kind of far back behind the rest of the world. And so now they're the world's first, in 1922, the world's first communist government. Okay, the idea that everyone should be treated equally, the idea that people should live communally, and that the government should control land and capital to benefit the working class becomes a first model of government in the world. Okay, and we'll see in the next unit how this really doesn't work out as Marx intended, where everybody lives peacefully and happily and government withers away. It turns out pretty nasty in the Soviet Union, and in reality, every other country that has tried true communism, that's what ends up happening. Socialism, one point I need to make is socialism at this point is different from communism. Communism, as we conceive it, is the Soviet model. North Korea, China used to have that. They've got a little bit different now. and oppresses people. Socialism as it exists, even today, does not oppress people, still allows democratic government and free speech and thought, but government has more of a role on the economy. Okay, so I hope everybody has a great day, and I will see you guys tomorrow.